Welcome to Profiting from the Sale of Your Baseball Cards. Today we're going to be discussing controversial players enshrined in the Baseball Hall of Fame. Controversial choices and decisions. So there are many books that basically address this problem with the Hall of Fame, from the Cooperstown Casebook to Cooperstown Confidential, and what happened to the Hall of Fame. It requires 75% of the vote cast by members of the Baseball Writers Association of America. Player must be retired 5 years before becoming eligible. They are moved from the ballot after 10 years. They are moved if player receives less than 5% of the votes. They must be retired 16 years before a player can be reconsidered eligible by the Veterans or Era Committee. Hall of Fame enshrinement is meant to honor the greatest players of all times. The voting procedure is sometimes weird and open to favoritism, personal vendettas, and crusades. So Jackie Robinson, as great as he was, barely got into the Hall of Fame. He received a mere 4 votes above the 75% required to be enshrined in the Hall of Fame. His stats were amazing, especially considering he only had a 10-year career because he entered the league at age 28. He had a .313 batting average, a batting title, an MVP, 7 times All-Star, 1,563 hits, 141 home runs. But his home runs and RBIs weren't the thing. It was really his base stealing and helping the team to win any way that was ethical and possible. Roger Hornsby got into the Hall of Fame, but yet he was somewhat known for his non-sportsman-like behavior and racism. He had the credentials, a lifetime batting average of .358, and 3 times he batted over 400. In fact, his .424 was at one time the highest average of anyone in baseball other than LaJoy, and he had 2 Triple Crowns. He was unliked by players as their manager, and rumors he was a member of the KKK and anti-Catholic. Ty Cobb was almost known as well for his baseball as he was for his non-sportsman-like behavior. He certainly had credentials, the highest all-time average of .366, 4,000 hits, 117 home runs, RBIs, 1944, an MVP, and 11 times batting average leader. But he was considered to be, and still is, considered to be the dirtiest player in baseball. He had cost fans, and he had been documented as a racist. Rumors also were rampant that he bet on baseball. Cap Anson, again, had the credentials, lifetime batting average of .334, 4 batting titles, 3,435 hits, 97 home runs, 2,075 RBIs, and a .394 on-base percentage. In 1890, he alone was instrumental in ensuring that no blacks entered into Major League Baseball. Prior to 1980, which is surprising to some people, black players were not uncommon in Major League Baseball. But Cap Anson refused to play against teams with black players, and the other opposing teams were forced to give in. Charles Kaminsky was the owner of the Chicago White Sox, and during the period of the famed 1919 Black Sox, that these players were banned because of throwing a game and taking bribes. However, though he was involved peripherally with these actions, no consequences. He humiliated and underpaid his players, which made them vulnerable to these bribes, and he was often labeled as a racial segregationist. Whitey Ford certainly, again, had the credentials. He had a 1-loss record of 236 wins and 106 losses, an ERA of 2.75, had 19 156 strikeouts, won the Cy Young, and 10 times as an All-Star. But he did admit he cheated in games, specifically cutting the ball with his ring or loading mud in the ball, which he gathered from the pitcher's mound, always saying that in order to be competitive after the age of 30, you need to practice these behaviors. And then there's a prejudice on the part of the Veterans Committee. The Veterans Committee has never enshrined an African American who played his entire career in the major leagues. They only inducted those who played also in the Negro Leagues. And there naturally was a lack of Black players before 1947 when all baseball players were white. So players like Maury Wills, Peter Blue, and Richie Allen may never get in the Hall of Fame until some considerations and changes are made in the Veterans Committee. Bobby Cox was enshrined in the Hall of Fame because of his managerial availability, and he recorded a 100-win season 6 times, a record matched only by Joe McCarthy. He was ejected the most of any manager, 29 times. In 1995, he was arrested on simple assault charges against his wife. He punched her in the face and pulled her hair during an argument. However, Cox said during a news conference there was no hitting of any sort. So it was this case of he said, she said, but nonetheless, that is on his background. Bud Selig was commissioner 1992 to 1998 de facto and officially from 1998 to 2015. He did not take the performance-enhancing drugs seriously during the era of the players who were hitting incredibly numbers of home runs, and he was allowed them to flourish probably because it was good for business in terms of the difficulties that they were having in terms of baseball at the time, that it was a good thing that this home run competitions and acceleration was happening. So he turned a blind eye perhaps to PED use, or certainly didn't enforce it. He did not institute strong drug screens until 2005. He was voted himself into the Hall of Fame veteran by the Hall of Fame Veterans Committee, which is composed of 16 Hall of Fame players. Alberto Alomar, again, had the credentials of a lifetime 300 average, 2,724 hits, 291 home runs, 1,134 RBIs, 12 All-Star games, and was known for his glove work and had 10 Golden Gloves. He, however, was placed on an eligible list after an investigation into a sexual misconduct allegation made against him. Also was fired as a consultant by Major League Baseball. However, Alomar will remain enshrined in the Hall of Fame. And then we kind of get into the current era where the PED scandal runs from 1980 to the 2000s. This was against the Major League Baseball because the players were able to, through the use of these enhancement drugs, gain an edge, inflate their statistics. It really was wholesale cheating, but there were no clear rules or guidelines regarding its use and induction into the Hall of Fame. We know that there was a 2005 congressional steroids hearing, which implicated some players. We also know that Canseco accuses his Texas teammates in 2005 in his book, Juiced, of being on steroids. And also a 2009 New York Times report alleging the 103 players that tested positive in 2003, which was really before the enforced testing began in 2004. So these are the players that basically are alleged PED and steroid users by these background checks. And most of them, until the rulings are changed, probably will not enter into the Hall of Fame, despite whatever statistics that they bring to the table. Some alleged PED users may be given an unfair pass. So there's Andy Pettit, Miguel Tejeda, Gary Sheffield, Jason Gallanby, that may or may not basically get through into the Hall of Fame despite questions of their use. Adrian Beltre and Johan Santana are alleged, but again, they're coming up for eligibility soon. But there are 3 players that alleged, and we'll talk about them at greater length, are using PEDs that have made it into the Hall of Fame, which makes it now difficult and kind of a slippery slope for not allowing the other players to come in who are accused of being on steroids or PEDs. So Mike Piazza, certainly when we look at his credentials, are fitting for the Hall of Fame. Lifetime average of 308, 427 home runs, that 400 club, 2,127 hits, 2,000 or more hits, between that 30 and above on base percentage, 12 All-Star games, 10 Silver Sluggers, 12 Golden Gloves, and Rookie of the Year. But he did admit to taking the PND Andro, which is an over-the-counter PED. And he also had a pimply back, either due to skin conditions or taking steroids. So it's questionable whether or not he was on steroids, but still has made it into the Hall of Fame. Then we look at Ivan Rodriguez, and we find that he also had the appropriate credentials to enter the Hall of Fame in terms of a 286 lifetime batting average, 311 home runs, 2,472 hits, a greater than 300 on-base percentage, made MVP 14 times All-Star, but most impressively, his 13 Gold Glove awards as a catcher. But he is linked to PED because Jose Canseco wrote in his book that he personally injected Pudge with steroids. When he was asked if he was on the list of the 103 reported by the New York Times, he said, "Only God knows." And his physique varied fairly radically over the years, with it being beefier pre-testing and noticeably smaller once testing was implemented. And finally, just recently elected to the Hall of Fame, David Ortiz, original name David Ortiz Uria. He had, again, the significant credentials to enter the Hall of Fame, 286 lifetime batting average, over 500 home runs, 1,700 plus RBIs, over 2,000 hits, over 300 on-base percentage, 10 All-Star games, and 7 Silver Sluggers, and a World Series MVP. By the 2009 New York Times, he was one of the accused of testing positive for PEDs in 2003, prior to Major League Baseball testing in 2004, but he claimed he never tasted positive. But nonetheless, he is now in the Hall of Fame. Probably all three of these are more than deserving. It's not for me to judge whether they should be in there or not, or whether they use PEDs, but because it's questionable, it kind of opens up a crack in terms of letting other players eventually get into the Hall of Fame. Harold Baines, again, recently admitted into the Hall of Fame. And here's where his credentials and stats are questionable, not in terms of he wasn't a very good player, but are they at the level of greatness that basically the Hall of Fame is designed to honor. So his big thing is having 2,866 hits. That's his main achievement. And some argue that his career extending more than 20 years, that longevity allowed him to pile up plate appearances, which allowed him to kind of have those extra hits as a designated hitter. And as far as a defensive player, that was not his forte. So again, it opens up a crack for people who don't have those great potentials to get in if they compare themselves to those credentials that Harold Baines had in entering the Hall of Fame. Larry Walker, he had very impressive credentials, most of which were achieved at Coors Field in Denver, Colorado. A lifetime batting average of 313, 3 batting titles, 339 home runs, 1,300 plus RBIs. He had MVP, 5 All-Stars, 7 Gold Gloves, 3 Silver Sluggers, and a 400 on-base percentage. Impressive, but weak stats, some feel, for the Hall of Fame enshrinement. And much of these inflated stats people feel because he played Coors Field, which was hitter-friendly ballpark. So undeserving Hall of Famers. And of these, we look historically back to Frankie Fish, who did make it into the Hall of Fame. And he became committee chairman of the Veterans Committee. And he voted in his friends and teammates. So these individuals, Freddie Lindstrom, Chick Haffey, Jesse Haynes, George Kelly, Travis Jackson, Dave Bancroft, probably not at the kind of echelon of most Hall of Famers, but perhaps favoritism got them in. Then you have other undeserving players that are legends. Bobby Wallace hit 268 with very little powers in the Hall of Fame. And then you have Rick Farrell, Rick Farrell was said to have durability and ability to maintain his sanity towards the end of his career. And that is his claim to fame, they say, in getting in the Hall of Fame. And then you have Marquard, and he was below .500 pitcher, 119 and 131 record, and got into the Hall of Fame. Then you have Tony Lazzari, and Tony Lazzari is said to have had a kind of mediocre kind of statistics. He had a 293 batting average, 7 times had over 100 RBIs, but his glory was by association, playing alongside greats like Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, and Joe DiMaggio, and his association, they say, got him into the Hall of Fame. And then you have Joe Gordon. He had 1,800 career hits and over 300 home runs. But again, it may have been his association with the Yankees and playing for them during their golden years. Then you have Bill Mazeroski. And Bill Mazeroski was very good with a glove, but his hitting was mediocre, as his average shows at 260 with 138 home runs over 17 seasons, but made Hall of Fame. Again, good players, lots of positives, but the fact that they were mediocre stats, kind of wonder if other players comparing themselves could get into the Hall of Fame. Then you have Jim Bunning. Jim Bunning did pitch a perfect game, but he only won 120 games once and finished with a 54% rate of winning. And you have Bert Blyleven. Bert Blyleven had lots of wins and lots of losses. No Cy Young awards, and never led in ERA or wins, and just led once in strikeouts. And finally, Bruce Sutter. Bruce Sutter did lead his league in saves 5 times, but so did Dan Quisenberry, who's not in the Hall of Fame, who was every bit as good. So these are just some of the controversies that come along in terms of what players make it and what's the bar that you're comparing them to, and kind of an interesting background, and kind of gives you an insight into the controversies of the Hall of Fame. So if you are interested in learning additional information about the baseball card industry, the history of baseball cards, profiting and investing in baseball cards, or ideas to bring the fun back into collecting, be sure to follow us. And feel free to view our library of YouTube videos. And please take a moment to hit the subscribe button. Also, check out our eBay store, where we have available for sale many of the cards shown in these videos. So I bid you farewell today, and take the day off, and we'll talk later.